Good evening, Houston. Welcome to join us. And tonight, this is Public Affairs, Public Access. And Blueprint Houston is sponsoring a discussion tonight and presenting on the next million. I'm Joe Webb. I'm one of the panelists. And this discussion is about the growth in Houston. And if you happen to be noticing what's going on behind each of us, it's scenes of Houston, the place we know, the place we call home. You probably will recognize some. Who knows? We'll see. But tonight also we would like to make sure that we recognize a former city councilman, Larry Green. We're sorry to hear of his passing. He was a strong supporter of the items and the things that Blueprint Houston wanted to do, and the fact that helped get the general plan in place. We're sad to hear of his loss, and that neighborhood lost a champion. He believed in what we were doing, and he saw the benefits for not only the city, but for his constituents and his neighborhood. And with that, I'm going to throw it over to Jim Hill, who will introduce the panelists and get us started on the discussion.
Okay, well, thank you, Joe. And I'll begin by just quickly introducing our panelists here. Immediately to my right here is Patrick Walsh, the director of the City of Houston's Planning and Development Department. Pat brings 19 years of experience in community development, planning, engineering, and municipal infrastructure management to his position. As director, he's Houston's top planning and development official and has oversight over the city's primary property subdivision regulatory rules. And he also leads much of Houston's transportation and other long-range community planning efforts, including the Major Thoroughfare Plan, the Bicycle Master Plan, and Complete Streets Program. Prior to being at the City of Houston, he served as Transportation and Long-Range Planning Director for the City of Sugar Land. He's got a Bachelor of Science degree in Civil Engineering from Carnegie Mellon and a Master's of Science degree in Civil Engineering from the University of Texas at Austin, and he's a native Houstonian. Welcome, Pat.
Thank you, Jim. Great to be here.
Mm-hmm. And then over here is Josh Sanders, who is a lobbyist focused on providing government relations and policy advocacy for clients facing regulatory and procurement issues. And I guess you're also a lobbyist for Houstonians for Responsible Growth, and that is, I guess, your principal role here tonight as sort of a representative of the development community and sort of the Houston way of doing things. And Josh also serves in various stakeholder capacities at the City of Houston, including the General Plan Steering Committee, the Walkable Places Planning Commission Subcommittee, and the Redevelopment and Drainage Task Force. And his experience also includes serving on the staff of U.S. Congressman Henry Bonilla and the campaign staff of Lieutenant Governor David Dewhurst. And Josh has a BA in Political Science from Texas State University. And my colleague Joe is, we're both on the board of Blueprint Houston. Joe is an architect, urban planner, and principal of Webb Architects. He's the immediate past chair of Blueprint Houston, and he's served the community in matters regarding planning and urban design for over 30 years. Through advocacy, lobbying, speaking, writing, volunteering, and practice, Joe embraces urban planning as a core idea of his architectural career. Joe is a graduate of the College of Architecture at the University of Houston and a past president of AIA Houston and a licensed architect in several states. And finally, just a few biographical notes about me. I'm also an architect, urban planner, and I'm currently serving as vice chair of Blueprint Houston. I have a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering, Pat, actually. Also from, mine is from Rice University.
I approve.
And then also I have a Master's of Architecture degree. I kind of saw the error of my ways. And, anyway.
Whoa. Take it all back.
And then I've actually lived in Houston since I came to Rice, and that was 43 years ago. But prior to that, I grew up in Europe, so I bring kind of that perspective to. I spent 12 years living in Germany, and then before that, I was actually born and lived in Morocco for 6 years. So, anyway, so that's sort of who we are, and let's turn now to the topic of tonight's discussion. I'm going to spend about 10 minutes or so taking you through a presentation that describes what we're talking about here, which we're calling the next million. And by which we mean the next million in population. So the next slide, please. We see that if you look at the projections, whether it's from the Census Bureau or HGAC, We expect to add about another 1 million people by 2045, so less than 30 years. That's just in the city of Houston itself. In Harris County, we're going from about a current 4 million population to 6 million population. So Harris County will add 2 million people. That's including the people that will be in Houston. And then for the 8-county region, so the metropolitan region, we'll go from about 6 million people to 10 million people. So that's a pretty significant increment of growth. But by the 1 million, we're talking about the people within the current city limits of Houston. So next slide, please. So we want to talk about where can we grow and how can we grow? Because as we will see, I'll explain each of these in just a little more detail. Our land area in the city is more or less fixed right now. We don't really have the ability to continue annexing the way we used to. Our floodplains, as we found out with Harvey, we're now considering the possibility of actually reducing the amount of developable area, that perhaps we shouldn't be building on these floodplains and maybe we should vacate them to some degree. And then, of course, we have many other areas, parks and neighborhoods that are fairly well developed and deed restricted that really aren't going to change very much. So our area for available growth within the city limits is quite limited. And our position is that really we can't continue growing in the same conventional pattern that we've been used to. And therefore, we need a plan. So let me just go through each of these points in just a little more detail. So here, this image is the, you can see, no, we went backwards there, but yeah. In yellow, we have the current city limits of Houston. And as I just mentioned, we really are not able to annex anymore for political reasons primarily. But so this is more or less what we've got in terms of, all right. Is that better? Okay. And then you see that a lot of the area there in pink is the extraterritorial jurisdiction, somewhat under the control of the city of Houston. But that encompasses most of Harris County, and that's where we expect to see another more or less 1 million people. Then the next slide. And then our floodplains, as we found out during Harvey, significant areas of the city were impacted. And areas like Meyerland, we're now talking about, is it even prudent to continue living there, and should we be buying out? And so in some sense, that's going to reduce the available land that we have for development. Next slide. And many areas are stable. In this image here, sort of at the upper left, you see Memorial Park, and then below that is River Oaks. Now, those areas are really not going to be able to take any of this 1 million people. River Oaks is not really going to change very much. But right around that, you see on the left, that's the uptown area, and then you've got the Westheimer corridor and the Washington Avenue corridor. Now, those areas are seeing significant redevelopment. So there is, obviously, we've been absorbing a significant amount of population growth there. Next, please. But if you look at the city's land use map, basically everything that's colored, just about everything is colored, it is already used. It's occupied already. There's a few areas in gray that you might be able to pick out, primarily on the east end, and then some areas south of Loop 610. Where that's gray and it's vacant area. So that's available for development, but very limited areas, as you can see. Next. And then if you look at just a typical developed area of Houston, this represents probably about 32 square miles, which is about 5% of the city's area. So in order for this area to take the proportionate share of the 1 million, that's another 50,000 people that somehow have to be fit into this image. And probably more, since a lot of areas are either floodplain or well protected and so forth. So quite a challenge. Next, please. And now this is a really interesting image, because the blue circles represent the platting activity in the last several years in the city of Houston. And this is number of lots platted, which is the size of the circle. And you can see that within the city limits in the yellow area, it's very much small-scale activity, and this is primarily things like taking a few single-family lots and cutting them up into townhouse lots. And you can see that there are no big circles, which means that large-scale raw land subdivision, that game is pretty much over within the city limits. So the conventional growth pattern really can't continue as we've been seeing it from the entire history of Houston. Next, please. And we are going to continue to see conventional suburban growth. Remember, there's another 3 million people coming beyond the city limits, and that's primarily going to be that kind of pattern. That's where all the large-scale subdivision activity is happening. So that's going to continue, but it's not going to be within the city limits. And within the city limits, we are seeing quite a bit of dense urban infill, but that can be very controversial. That image on the right is the Ashby high-rise that many of you are probably familiar with. A high-density project, a high-rise in the middle of a neighborhood. So that's how do we continue to deal with those kinds of issues? Next, please. So our contention at Blueprint Houston is that we need a plan. And we actually have one, as it turns out. A couple of years ago, the city of Houston went through a process of conducting a plan process and produced Plan Houston. Now, we would say, Joe and I would say, that that was a good start, but it's a start of a plan, and we need to continue to evolve Plan Houston. If we continue, Plan Houston, the next slide, please. The Plan Houston, as adopted, it contains some really radical proposals. It's things we haven't done in the past to develop and maintain a comprehensive mobility plan. That's actually in Plan Houston. We want to encourage compact, pedestrian-friendly development around transit. We want to anticipate growth and plan for it, ensuring that infrastructure and services accommodate growth. I mean, those are all great things. And these are direct quotes from Plan Houston. So these things are adopted as policy, if you will. Now, I don't know if we're actually working on these things, if we're funded, if we have staff, budget to do this sort of stuff, but we'll discuss that in due course as we open up the discussion. So if we could have the next slide. I think there's just a few left here, and we can turn it over to discussion. So here's an image of sort of inner loop Houston, where you can see a little bit of what we've been talking about. You can see in the foreground some townhouses. These used to be single-family houses in the past. And then you see some of the tall buildings that pop up sort of randomly throughout wherever there's an opportunity. And then beyond, there's kind of a green area, which is River Oaks and Memorial Park, stable areas. And then in the very distant background, you can see Uptown. So it's got a little bit of a snapshot. In this picture, you see a little bit of all of the different kinds of things happening in Houston. And we are going to try to continue to fill this in and increase our population by 50% over the next 25 years or so. I think that may be our last. I came back to this image just to kind of leave it there. Again, just to remind us what the growth trajectory is. 1 million more people within the city limits, another 2 million in Harris County, including the 1 million in Houston, and a total of 4 million over the region. Now that's, if you think about the kind of congestion and so forth that we've been talking about already, we think we're facing a pretty significant challenge. So let me just open it up for discussion and maybe just start with Pat. I'd like for all of you to answer this question. Where are we going to put the next 1 million people?
Well, first of all, let me just first say thank you to Blueprint Houston for bringing this group together. And let me say, I think that this issue is just super timely right now. I think we need to be thinking about the next 1 million people coming to the city and much more than that coming to the region and start thinking through how do we accommodate them. Change is coming, like it or not. Mm-hmm. And it's my belief that there are better outcomes than others, and that with some good planning we can and we should attempt to influence those outcomes. That's when you think about where this next 1 million goes, you can imagine different scenarios, and some of them, from my perspective, look better than others. When you think about the way this region has grown, I think let's just say it has been a sprawling growth pattern. There have been benefits to that. This region is, I would argue, more affordable to your average middle class and family who's looking to buy that home, because we have had this sprawling growth pattern. There's been a lot of land. We have had a approach to transportation in this region focused on adding freeway capacity, and that has opened up a lot of land for development, and it has helped retain an affordability to this region. And I think that's a very serious benefit. Of course, there's a flip side to that, and there's a number of downsides to that sprawling pattern. When you think about, you do have the congestion of all the radial freeways coming into the core every day, and it's not very transit feasible. And of course, inside the core of the city, we've got a transportation network of our own thoroughfares that is just bursting at the seams, trying to keep all these cars that come in every day moving. We've got the sprawling growth pattern means that it's less efficient for the delivery of services. Government agencies like the city of Houston, or all kinds of other different municipal utility districts and other government organizations have to provide services, and the more compact you are, in terms of utilities or even transit becomes more feasible when you have more compact growth. There's issues related to tax base and the city being fiscally healthy, and the more compact you are, the cities are more fiscally healthy. And if a city has more money to spend, that means more police officers and more firemen and more parks and amenities. And so there's a benefit to having more compact growth pattern. When there's air quality and there's conservation of habitat and all the rest. And of course, now we're very focused on this big issue of flooding that is also, it is exacerbated by the sprawling growth pattern, because when you do have all that we call impervious cover, those rooftops and concrete, that means more runoff, and the region drains from west to east, and so all of that area to the west of Houston is generating more runoff than it used to. Yes, there are detention requirements that do help, but I think there's a legitimate question as to whether or not that impact is fully mitigated. I'm sure Josh will have some comments about everything I'm saying, but I do think it's something that we need to think through. And we have the judge of Harris County, Judge Emmett, now saying things like, we need to stop development in the Katy Prairie, for example. And I think that's a laudable goal and something we do need to be thinking about. So, answer to your question, there are definitely better outcomes than others. I think Mayor Turner has been talking very correctly about growing up and not out. Mm-hmm. And forgive me, I'm getting over a bit of a cold. So we need to focus on identifying consensus on the outcomes that we want, and then how do we actually get there?
Yeah. Okay. Josh, your reaction to that?
Yeah, a couple things, and as Pat said, thank you very much for having this discussion. Pat, Joe, and myself were part of the steering committee with the general plan Houston, and it was a great couple years of getting a good core group of people together in the city that had different perspectives. That I think were really able to come together and produce a good document to begin with and to guide future discussions. And I think that's really what we were looking at doing is trying to, when you come from a culture of planning, or you don't come from a culture in planning in Houston, and it's new and it's something we want to get started as a kind of a process and more of a acceptable and encouraged thing. I think Plan Houston did a good job kind of kicking things off that way. But a couple points I'll make on just Houston in general and our land use system and some of the advantages, but also I think what some of the things we've needed to work on. And really, I think that's what Houstonians for Responsible Growth has done over the years is, looking at, obviously, yes, our system has done a great deal for affordability, as Pat mentioned. But another thing I think is really neat to watch is the flexibility that our system provides us when we do start to redevelop. And what I mean by that is, the fact that we have a system based on deed restrictions. And a lot of these larger parcels that we're looking at in the area that are going to be redeveloped into higher density, mixed use, you're starting to see home builders go in and buy old industrial sites, old apartment complexes, and build kind of mini master plan, high density, single family housing communities. Having the ability to not have the constraints of typical land use zoning is allowing our city to respond to market demand much quicker. It's now a matter of how do we make sure that there's infrastructure in place to support that increased density. And so, the city of Houston, I think, has done a good job of utilizing special districts. The Uptown area, which you mentioned, is a prime example of that. Downtown, the medical center. All of these areas experienced tremendous growth, but were also supported by public investment in infrastructure. And a lot of the times, developers, we say if you set the table, like, we'll sit down and eat. And if public planning and coordination of where we want to invest in public infrastructure to help guide some of that growth, I think we need to look at more creative ways going forward because of a scarce amount of resources. And Plan Houston was kind of starting that conversation of, well, we've got different special districts, we've got a county, we've got a city, we have other cities in the area. There's different pots of money, federal government, state. Are we looking at all these different areas of availability for funds to be able to help support some of these planning measures and some of these goals that we've set forward in Plan Houston? And so, as we start to add a lot more density over the next couple of years, I think you're starting to see the market and the region respond to that potential growth coming. And another prime example of that is the downtown central business district with this downtown living initiative. So that was, projecting future potential growth, the city looking at an area where they wanted to spark not only more residential but more commercial to kind of revitalize the downtown core, and obviously that has spill-out effect on the rest of the area around downtown. But that was all done through a public abatement program and an essential subsidy to help guide some of that growth.
Joe?
Basically, Mayor Turner, back when we did the same slide presentation to a group of people down at City Hall, in his comments, and Pat was quoting him directly, we have to grow up, meaning denser and not out. And that's something that I think he's hit on part of the way to achieve it. The question is, how do we achieve it?
Yep.
We've got some things to do. One thing that we have advocated at Blueprint is, over the years, is that we need to worry about growth and development, mobility, neighborhoods, housing, infrastructure. And out of Plan Houston, there were 12 core strategies, and I can give you a little bit of how those interrelate, because I think if we're going to understand where to put those next million, we've got some homework to do, to say the least. And the fact that if we're going to grow responsibly, that's one of the core strategies. We need to anticipate growth, plan for it, ensuring that infrastructure and services are there to accommodate, just like Josh was talking about. How do we incentivize growth if we don't have the infrastructure there? So we need to be sure where, what we've got and, how we put it there. And where we talk about connections and mobility, this is straight out again of the core strategies. It's connecting people in places. We need to develop and maintain a comprehensive mobility plan. And neighborhoods, that's back to using localized planning to help neighborhoods improve and maintain their quality of life. Housing, that's back to developing and maintaining a comprehensive housing policy. And then infrastructure, obviously, is accommodating the growth, anticipate it, and then try and meet the community's changing needs, because we're advocating that in essence. In fact, we're talking about denser instead of sprawling out. So if we can start getting those kinds of things in place, then I think we've got a chance of answering part of the question.
Okay, so I think I kind of heard some similar things from all of you, that we've got to get denser. That's the next increment of growth that we have to have. As the mayor says, we've got to grow up, not out. And so let me present kind of a thesis here, which is to say that denser growth requires large-scale coordination. And what I mean by that is, from the beginning of Houston's history, we've grown in a particular way. From zero to the first 2 million, what we did is we would subdivide raw land. We took a bunch of prairie land and we would carve it up into single-family lots, and that's kind of been the growth pattern all along. And so we've got, and that's really the way our regulations are still set up. I mean, Chapter 42 is fundamentally a subdivision ordinance, and it's kind of bumping up against the limits of what it can really do. And as that graphic showed, where the platting activity, large scale subdividing is just not happening within the city limits anymore. In fact, the next type of growth, denser growth, it requires almost a reversal of that process. Instead of going from big parcel subdivided into small pieces, we want to try to aggregate small pieces. Developers talk about the challenges of assembling land. I mean, that's the name of the game in the redevelopment, is you got to get enough critical mass together that you can actually do something with it. And you see those opportunities, like say a city center where that used to be a mall for, so that's already like a 50, 60 acre parcel that can be used to do something with. So that's, how do we do that? I mean, how do we go from this momentum that we've got of subdividing, big to small, and then try to reverse that process and incentivize denser growth?
Well, yeah, let me tackle that. I think step one is deciding what are our preferred kind of growth patterns. Okay, we actually, we have some indication in Plan Houston of what some good outcomes are. And that's a great start, but it's very high level. I mean, it talks about having vibrant and connected activity centers. It talks about encouraging compact, pedestrian-friendly development around transit. It talks about maintaining a parking strategy that supports economic development, protects neighborhoods, and achieves vibrant, walkable activity centers. So there's indications of what we want here, but I think...
But how do we actually do it? I mean, is somebody working on policy or ordinances?
There is, and so once you have consensus on what, which I really don't think we're quite there yet even. I mean, because I think this is so high level that it needs to be flushed out even more. I mean, to me, a great outcome for development is along our light rail lines. That's a perfect place for denser, compact development to occur. And activity centers like downtown, like your Greenway plazas, uptown, those are areas where it makes sense to have lots of people, lots of jobs all together in places where you can take short trips by bike, walking, transit, and you don't have to add another car just because you're adding more development necessarily. It's not proportionate. So once we have some consensus, a little more consensus on what's preferred, then I think what one of the beauties of Plan Houston is, it made a statement that it's okay for us to work together towards achieving those outcomes, okay? Because I think prior to Plan Houston, there was a bit more of a sense that, as a community, we really shouldn't decide, what our preferences are for growth and development and how to go about achieving them. Let's just let the market decide. And absolutely, the market should decide a lot of this, but it's okay. I think there's a growing acceptance that it's okay for us all to kind of come together and work together towards proactively kind of influencing and nudging some of these outcomes in a particular direction that obviously makes better sense for us and is in the public interest. So there are tools that we have as the city and as other partners to help influence growth and development outcomes. So what are they? There's four big ones that occurred to me. And Josh mentioned one, which is incentives. And the Downtown Living Initiative really was a good example, I think, of the public providing an incentive to achieve an outcome where, by adding, it's $15,000 per unit. So it's a substantial amount of money. But we drove a whole...
5,000 new units.
5,000 new units that are coming online downtown. And you think about that, every one of those people living downtown and working downtown is another car you're taking off the roadway, and you're able to generate more tax base in the core of Houston, and all of the public infrastructure is already there. You don't have to build new sewer lines and water lines and roadways and transit lines. That's all there. So the incremental cost to the public is low, but the tax value is quite significant. So I think there's a kind of a win-win there when you're able to drive that kind of growth. So one example of how to influence growth is incentives. Another big one, and this is kind of one of my priorities I talk a lot about this, is transportation investments. I do believe that when you build it, they will come. And what we see, we built the light rail lines. We're seeing growth along the light rail lines, and the same is true for highway investments into the periphery of the region. When you expand those freeways out into the periphery, you are going to see growth. And in fact, Jim, you showed the map of where the platting is occurring. The subdivision the growth is happening. Much of it is happening along the Grand Parkway. And the construction of the Grand Parkway has attracted a lot of growth out into the periphery. And I would argue that if we had not built the Grand Parkway, that growth would probably be going somewhere else. I think a greater percentage of it would be coming into the core of the city, and you would see more growing up, not out. I mean,
Are we saying that the Grand Parkway was maybe counterproductive as far as densifying the inner city?
I would say it has probably attracted a greater share of the regional growth outside of the city limits.
Yeah.
I think that's a fair statement. I know that there's probably a debate to be had about whether or not that's a good or a bad thing.
Yeah.
But I think there are downsides, and I think post Harvey is kind of a wake up call that all that growth that's happening on the west side is I believe driving additional floodwaters towards the city, and it's something that we need to be thinking about. So anyway, getting back to your question, what can we do? Incentives, making sure our transportation investments are the type of investments that we want. Then there's two other things. There's our regulations, and you mentioned Chapter 42. That's part of our Code of Ordinances. And then finally, capital investments in general. If you build a great park in the heart of the city, you might start to see growth around that park. If you see Discovery Green or Market Square in downtown Houston, there's a lot of growth happening around those parks, and those capital investments can influence private location decisions of the development community. So there are things that the public can do, I think, in a very positive way to influence growth and development outcomes.
Okay.
Yeah, and to add on to that, when we are dealing with an environment where city resources, governments are strapped with what they can spend money on, investments in infrastructure projects, we've traditionally, when we've done economic development incentives in 380s at the city of Houston, they've very much been kind of a rifle shot, and it's more of we'll abate whatever infrastructure is needed to help get this certain project complete. Where we think, and this even translates over to regional detention and other types of things, we ought to be trying to find more ways to leverage and partner with private investment that's coming in to these larger development projects. Because when you're looking at a size and scale of what would eventually be a $400 million development project, if you're adding in $15 to $20 million of cost per se that could be used in maybe a community benefit agreement where you can take some of that specific marked increment and utilize it in another area of town, you're doing it based upon the projected growth and revenue that you're going to be getting. So I think there's an opportunity for the city to be more, creative and expansive in ways that they do partner with private investment when developers are building these size of scale projects.
Yeah. Well, and one thing Pat was talking about was looking at all the existing rail stops and the potential for, call it transit-oriented development. I mean, we've got, how do we get there? We've actually got a couple of things in place. The transit corridor study, along with some of the ordinance stuff that was put in place that could be activated. The other question is how maybe could we take advantage of what the city did during the regional planning process when they developed the urban framework plan? Because, we truly are a multinodal city. We've got lots of activity areas. So how do we activate those, connect that, and maybe that's another way to do what you're talking about. We've got some data, we've got some direction. We need to maybe flesh it out a little further, update it, and see where we take it.
Okay. I hear a lot of talk about incentives, and I've done some planning in other cities through the country that are zoned, of course, and I think you're right about that our lack of zoning does afford us some flexibility, because what zoning has traditionally been focused on doing is two things primarily: limiting density and also segregating land uses. And that's two things you don't want to do if we're talking about the kind of growth
Yeah,
that we're
we
talking.
kind of organically get to a point where
Yep.
planners want to be.
But however, I mean,
uses.
that flexibility and kind of that lack of
Agree with that.
constraints, I would argue that it's pretty difficult to it's very easy to put incentives in place when you say, okay, we're going to lift the density cap all of a sudden, or we're going to allow you to mix uses. There's not a lot to give. I mean,
Great point.
in Houston.
And we've going through various just planning processes at the city, we always kind of get to the point where we say, well, what can we do to help incentivize this? And we've had other people come into town and have looked at our system and basically said, like, there's nothing for us to remove.
Yeah.
That would incentivize
Right.
development from a regulatory standpoint.
Sure.
There aren't many barriers.
There's not very many barriers, and so.
Josh, are you saying we need more barriers? I'm interpreting you right.
But you're right. Like, how do you do that?
Yeah.
Is it economic? Is it stuff we're looking at with the transit corridors ordinance or walkability, where
Yeah.
it's economic in a sense we're giving you more developable land
Yeah.
to be
Yeah.
able to utilize?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if I could jump in, and we have tried the incentives. The transit corridor ordinance is a good example of that. Where just so our listeners are understanding what I'm talking about, the transit corridor ordinance was passed some years ago, and it is specific to the corridors where you have light rail, and on those corridors, the ordinance encourages more compact development, especially around the rail stations, and which makes perfect sense. The incentives that are packaged into that ordinance are, number one, more buildable area for the developer, and what it's called a reduced setback. So basically, under the transit corridor, the developers, if they opt in, it's an opt-in, it's optional. They don't have to do this, but they can build closer to the street, which in an urban walkable setting is actually a good thing anyway. You want those buildings closer to the street. And you also have a reduced parking requirement. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is that those incentives haven't been strong enough for whatever reason to really encourage most developers to opt in. I think it's something like 83% of the development that we've seen along the rail lines has not opted in to the transit
Well,
corridor
should we
rule.
consider remove it? And it's not an opt-in. It's a mandatory thing. Well, I know that's
I'm sure Josh is a huge supporter of that. But we are actively
Yeah.
considering that, and how we are actively considering that is through what's called this Walkable Places
Yeah.
project.
Yeah.
And Josh is actually serving on that committee, and we're having a very robust discussion amongst a bunch of stakeholders about what is the right next step.
Yeah.
Yep.
I guess
Well,
I'm
and there's
curious as to why we're not getting more people opting in.
Well, I think
That's
Or the
interesting.
I think there's, and we talk about this, and I mentioned this point on the committee. I think it's due to a number of factors, and if you look at timing of when these infrastructure projects finished, the Main Street line finished 2007, and that was really kind of the end of a development era, and that was right before the recession, and so you had a lot of cooling off within the real estate market at that point.
Yeah.
You also had a lot of increase in price along that area for preparation of potential
Right.
TOD development. Now we've just gotten the extension of the North Main line, we've got the Harrisburg line, we've got the Southeast line, and so I think you'll start to see more of it. And I think why we would prefer more of an opt-in with, I think, a more robust incentive package, and whether that's working with a Midtown TERS or management district to see what types of partnerships or types of funding they could provide, or the CBD or the near north side TERS, just figuring out different ways. I think you'll see more of a response to that, but you didn't want to limit some of that temporary in-between growth or change in uses that may be precluded by making it a mandatory.
Yeah.
But I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion. I mean, but I think it's a legitimate question. I mean, there's been a huge public investment in these light rail lines, and the question is, should we make it required for the development near the rail stations to be more urban, pedestrian kind of, I would argue, pedestrian friendly. And you know, there are still benefits to the development community by doing that. You're getting more buildable areas, so you're building closer to the street. You will get reduced parking. The question is, should we just require that you opt, you know, that you opt in and build
Require
closer to the
optional.
street and get, but not have to put in as much parking? And I think that's a significant benent to the development.
And you know, when we talk about parking and just transportation in general, and you know, mass transit, fixed ways, and right now we've made a huge investment in light rail. We're about to see what maybe a BRT line can do over in the uptown area. If you look at how successful Metro has been in the region by utilizing our HOV lanes, we have a multitude of transportation options, I think, that are available from those standpoints. I would really love to see the city and Metro be more aggressive at finding partnerships with, you know, private companies, TNCs, to do first last mile. Because you know, a lot of it, if we want to have building that's dense, pedestrian oriented, less parking around some of these areas, we're going to have to rely on people not to drive their automobile there, right? So we're going to have to get them to these high capacity transit lines one way or another. And so figuring out a way to potentially do that, I think is important.
Can I comment, Jen? I mean, Josh is hitting on an important point, which relates to parking in general. And you know, people, we regularly get kind of hounded, especially by sort of the urban planning community. Hey, you know, just get rid of parking requirements. You know, just eliminate them, let the market decide. And let me say, actually, we do allow the market to decide already today in downtown and areas immediately around downtown. There are no parking requirements. All the parking that's provided downtown is totally market-based. Which I think is working well. Interestingly, you know, when we have considered reducing parking requirements outside of downtown, we get pushback. We get pushback from the neighborhoods. The neighborhoods are very concerned that people will end up parking their cars in front of their house on their residential street. And interestingly, we've actually gotten pushback from the commercial property owners too, because they're actually concerned that the next guy's going to come in without parking, and those cars are going to parking on their property.
Their property.
So, but I think the point I'm trying to make is, if you think about really walkable, enjoyable areas, those, you know, where real great placemaking has occurred, there's not very much parking there. It's not. I mean, having a sea of parking in front of a building is not a very walkable experience. And when you have less parking than you quote unquote need, what ends up happening is not that everybody's parking in the neighborhoods necessarily, but actually people start finding other ways to get there. You get more people walking there, biking there, riding Uber and Lyft. And it's not like it's a one-to-one exchange. One less parking space at the restaurant means another parked car in the neighborhood. That fraction doesn't work out. And so reducing parking is actually, I believe, an opportunity to create more walkable places, places people want to be. That is a hard hurdle for many neighborhoods to kind of get over and to recognize. But if you think about some of our most walkable places in Houston, your 19th Street in the Heights, or your Lower Westheimers, you know, those neighborhoods around there, they love living there. They love being able to walk and enjoy those very kind of interesting urban places, and it just works. And I understand that makes people nervous, but I mean, if you want walkable places, at some point you're going to have to accept less parking.
Well, and a good example
Or
of that
structured parking.
is there at Bagby and West Gray, what I call the post area, because of that original development. I mean, that is not just walkable, it's what several planning proponents call sittable. I mean, it's a place where you can go in and enjoy the neighborhood, sit and enjoy, be a part of the neighborhood. And so that whole area, that whole district, and yet it's not on a rail line. It's on transit, but you know, and yet it's minimal street parking. And I'm trying to think of where you put park in that area if you had to. So it's one of those places that's really working. So the question is, how do we replicate that?
Okay, I'm going to comment on that, but before I do that, I think we have about 15 minutes left, and we do have an opportunity for the audience to call in, but I suspect it may take a few minutes before we actually get our first call. So why don't we go ahead and put out that
Phone number?
call, and then show you the number, and then let me make one, while we're waiting for somebody to call in, just a comment about, to conclude this parking discussion. And the projects that I work on as an architect are dense urban mixed-use projects. And the developers are, for the moment, the city parking requirement is really not even considered, because the market wants more parking than what the city requires. Mm-hmm. So for the moment, that's what we're still planning for. But they are beginning to realize, if this ride sharing or whatever it may be really catches on, should we be smart about, well, they are thinking about, are we going to, can we take some of our parking that we're building in the garage, and say the top levels of the garage can be easily converted into some other use or something. So we are thinking a little bit about future proofing, is what we call it. Let's not, for the moment, we're nervous about under parking. But just in case that changes in the future, can we convert some of that parking into something else?
I was just going to say, even what autonomous vehicles will bring in the next 10 to 15 years.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine all the various readaptive uses of these massive parking garage structures we're going to have at this point.
Oh, yeah. No, that's a huge amount of land. And surface parking,
Yeah.
just an astounding amount of land that takes up.
Yeah, and Josh is right. I mean, the autonomous vehicles may completely reduce our need for parking because the cars can drop you off and head back out and pick up somebody else. So we absolutely need to be thinking about the automated vehicle future, which is really not very far away at all. And we need to be thinking about, if a parking garage were to be built, making sure that bottom floor can easily be modified to accommodate maybe retail or office or whatever in the future. That's just smart
As long as it's
planning.
not in the floodplain.
You had to get the floodplain.
So we haven't really touched on that.
Well, the thing about it is, if we start reducing all of that sea of asphalt, sea of concrete, we start impacting our ability to absorb. So, I mean, we've in that respect, we kind of done it to ourselves, because we park all over creation. We may have a chance to moderate some of that. There are lots of unanswered questions there, to say the least. How do we do it? But, those two are intertwined rather radically. So.
So I don't know how this. Do we actually hear the phone ring, or are we just going to go back?
Are we going to
Pass the message to you.
We're going to
Okay, I see. All right. Well, so for the moment, it appears we're still waiting for the audience.
Yeah.
But I've got another question to throw out. And for our audience, you may be aware that Amazon.com put out an RFQ last year, RFP actually, for their next headquarters 2, and the promise was of, this is not a warehouse, this is an actual headquarters, so it's well-paying jobs, tech jobs, 50,000 of them, I believe, as many as that, but they were specifically looking for a good urban environment, that kind of funky urbanism, what younger tech workers are attracted to. The short list came out, and it wasn't that short of a list. There's 20 cities, and Houston was not on it. Austin and Dallas were on it among the 2 Texas cities. So what went wrong with the Amazon RFP?
Well, Houston did make a strong concerted effort to attract Amazon here. The benefits would have been just incredible. And it's disappointing that we didn't secure it. I honestly don't know the answer to that question, but it's clear that this needs to be a teachable moment. We need to step back and learn from this. And I think, I don't know that any of us really know exactly what it was yet. But I think at some point we need to have those discussions and figure that out. I mean, there's certainly speculation, but it's really,
I would say,
speculating.
If nothing else, it has a lot of people talking about that very thing, as, is it quality of life? Is it the technology issue? Who knows? But, at least the point is being discussed now, and I think it may weigh into what we're doing.
I definitely think it sparked a great public conversation and kind of a self-examination at the same time. And whether it's the next Amazon or whether it's figuring out what our assets are, how to greatly more play off of some of our strengths, like our transportation from a global perspective with the port. All of our airports and Ellington potentially being able to be a spaceport. I mean,
I think because we checked all of those boxes. I mean, they wanted a big city, they wanted good universities, they wanted a big airport. I mean, we had all of that, and if you bother to look, we had a lot of that funky urbanism. I mean, okay, it's in certain areas.
It's in certain areas, yeah.
But Austin, most of Austin is, I mean, I don't think it's that much different from Houston, really. It's a lot of subdivisions and
it's actually
a lot of worse traffic congestion.
Yes.
And it's
in the US.
Well, and Dallas doesn't look that much different than Houston, to tell you the truth. So it's kind of what really drove it. We'll never know. So, but at least I think we can learn from.
Yeah, but I think they're clearly, those of us who have been here for a long time, maybe appreciate the charms of Houston perhaps more than others. But there's clearly a PR problem perhaps that has to be overcome there.
Yes. Well, I mean, we have a lot of great things going on for us right now. And I think, like I said, it's just allowing us to accelerate those even more than maybe we would have before. And Houston's one of those places where we're boom and bust, and we go through some pretty intense years of growing and just economic prosperity, and then we cool off for a little bit, and so maybe this is our chance to come roaring back in a way we would have never imagined or even planned before. So.
Okay. Well, speaking of roaring back, I'm surprised we haven't spent a little more time talking about the impacts of Harvey and what that means to us in terms of maybe reassessing how we grow, where we grow.
Yeah.
And who would like to maybe start us off on that one?
Well, Pat, aren't we looking at some revisions to ordinances to try and?
Yeah, there's a robust discussion going on right now. As a matter of fact, regarding what's called Chapter 19, the floodplain ordinance of the city. But let's just step back for a second. Obviously, Harvey was just a huge impact to the city, and we need to be learning from it. Mayor Turner has been extremely strong about saying we need to, be smarter about how we grow and think more carefully about how we redevelop, and we have to do things a little differently. And the mayor and his whole team have been very actively engaged, making sure that we're a more resilient city in the future. So that's a wake-up call. There's just this huge effort going on right now. It's actually a huge piece, but it's one of many huge pieces, is this discussion on Chapter 19, and it has to do with how high should what we call the finished floor, the floor of your structure at the bottom level be over what's called the floodplain elevation. So if you're in what's called the mapped floodplain, the 100-year floodplain or the 500-year floodplain, today's rules say that finished floor should be 1 foot above the 100-year elevation, and the proposal that the city has put forward is to shift that to 2 feet above the 500-year elevation, which depending on which watershed you're in, can be a pretty significant change. Some watersheds, the difference between the 100-year and the 500-year is over 5 feet. In many other places, it's less than a foot. So it just depends on the characteristics of the particular drainage channel.
Yeah.
But I mean, you can imagine in some parts of the city, if you were to build a new structure under this proposal, it would, that finished floor would have to be 5, 6, even more feet higher than you previously would have had to build that structure. So there's impacts there in terms of, the appearance of the structure, the character of neighborhoods might change because these houses will be higher. There's issues about walkability, and now you're going to have stairs to get up and in. So in your commercial areas, that may, there's questions about whether or not that's as walkable. But you're balancing all that against life safety issues. I mean, we don't want structures to flood, right? So that's just critically important. So it's that's a huge debate going on right now.
Well, and that also influences just where we can put another million people if we start.
And that's a great point. What is it? 37% of the city is right now currently in the 100 or 500 year floodplain. So that's a large portion of
That's a
the city.
chunk.
Yeah, that we're going to be talking about. That rules will be changed for development. So it's going to be interesting to see what that impact is when we do get done with all this.
But we're talking, but these rules affect new structures, the people who are already here and already in those floodplains and will continue to flood up.
Well, no, this affects additions. It affects if you have to invest more than a certain amount to upgrade it.
Yeah.
So it affects renovations. It affects a lot of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
But I think what you're saying is we need to improve our drainage system one way or the other, even if those aren't going to be, those are for
no matter what.
I mean, what can we do to mitigate the problems
and there's
for those who are already here?
There's a whole series of efforts ongoing right now, looking at a third reservoir to the west or northwest of the city. Looking at some very substantial channel improvements, perhaps along Buffalo Bayou and downtown, which could actually reduce the elevation of flooding by several feet just by having this additional channel on the north side of downtown.
Yeah, the river channel.
A number of detention systems that could be in place. And there's all kinds of other issues like buyouts.
Yeah.
And so that's a whole other issue that we could probably spend another
hour on that easily.
Another show for that one.
Yeah.
Well, I'm noticing that we've got about a minute left, and definitely want to thank everybody who tuned in tonight to listen to us. Hopefully you've learned a few things from it. I can guarantee you I know I have tonight, and it's been interesting. I want to thank Pat and Joshua for joining us tonight. If you've got questions or whatever, I'm sure you can send something to Blueprint Houston. It's www.blueprinthouston.org. If you've got some questions, we can do that for you. And we look forward to you, and hopefully we get to continue this. We're talking about other efforts to, again, bring these kinds of issues back into the public so that we get a good, solid community discussion going, because that's the only way we're going to help our elected officials decide where we go. Any last other comments, guys?
Just thank you. Yeah, great job. We really appreciate Blueprint Houston doing this.
We really
Great.
enjoyed it, and we could probably talk about this stuff all day long.
Sure,
We probably will.
Well, let's do this again real soon.
Yeah,
I'm happy to
definitely,
do
for
so.
sure. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how much time we do have, but again, thank you all. We got about 30 seconds. Okay. Again, on behalf of Blueprint Houston, thank you for joining us. We'll try and keep you informed in the future and other things. And do stay in touch with the city and talk to your council members. Let them know your thoughts on this. We thank you again. Have a good evening.